Elfquest released its first issue in black and white on low-budget newsprint in 1978, so that when I found it 12 years later, even the glossy full-color collections were relegated to the poorly lit sci-fi stacks in the back of my public library. I read a lot for a 12-year-old, so I was constantly back there digging for a new author. The graphic novel collections were larger than comic books, which were already larger than the paperbacks I generally read, so the Elfquest books really stood out on the shelves. As I dragged them down carefully from the top shelf I had to get a chair to reach, I noticed that they weren't text at all, they were comic books, but bound. This was my first experience with the graphic novel. My brother-in-law had grudgingly gifted me his comic collection when my sister ordered him to get rid of them, so I was no stranger to comic books, but this was different. This wasn't a monthly episodic tale, this was an epic adventure, which was rendered in glossy color and gorgeous detail. As I flipped through the book, I noticed that the story had to be large. It spanned 8 books. I immediately checked out the first 2. The story is too convoluted to go over in anything but brief, but it starts with a tribe of elves, one of who has been captured by essentially humans in the hunter-gatherer stage of history. Through his initial encounter, we learn much about the elves in question, the Wolf Riders, and the state of the world in this comic. This is where the process of defamiliarization starts, and draws us into this similar but very different world from our own. The world is eventually known as Abode, or the World of Two Moons. Through the course of the comic, we learn the history of the world. Much of the history, as I could explain it, does not flow well without the course of the story to guide it, but essentially the history of the Earth is differentiated by the arrivals of the elves on their world. Initially, elves arrive in prehistoric times, but the ephemeral magics are no match for the bestial humans of that time. Fortunately, the Wolf Riders are made of sterner stuff, though they have evolved in a peculiar way. The elves we are first acquainted with are nothing like normal fantasy elves. They are small and muscled, angular hunters who ride wolves. After they are driven out of their forest home in their recent encounter with the humans, who indiscriminately use fire to destroy their own home and the elves escape to the subterranean caverns of the trolls. The trolls, too, are a familiar idea turned on its head. In this world, they are the ones who can work metal and seek riches. We find that they, too, are a long way from their origins over the course of the story. The trolls eventually turn the naive wolf riders out into a desert, which they narrowly survive and stumble upon another tribe of elves, who've been sheltered by their difficult-to-reach location. This sets off a whole different arc in which the protagonist, Cutter, seeks to find and unite all the disparate tribes of elves in the world and find the truth of their ancestors, the High Ones, and reclaim their ancestral home, the Palace. This is just the overlying story, though. Most of the story is character-driven with the personal trials of Cutter and his tribe and the myriad of others they encounter throughout the story, including the Sun Elves, the Gliders, and the Go-Backs. The story of the elves was controversial in many ways, not the least of which was its presentation. A novelization of the initial story was published in Playboy magazine in 1982. The story was not particularly racy at first, but later there was both nudity and frank, if not graphic, depiction of sex. Another major controversy in Elfquest is the relative power of women in the story. Women had parity with men among the progressive elves, often ruling the tribes of elves or holding positions of high standing. Among the bestial humans and trolls, women are generally more marginalized, though troll women still manage to have power over their men in more traditionally feminine ways. Getting back to the adult themes in the story, as I mentioned before, sex was not shied away from. There was discussion of lovers and sharing, and sex was a convivial activity. Elves rarely conceive without the biologically imperative of recognition, so sex was mostly recreational. Several of the main characters, Skywise specifically, indulged in casual sex with many partners. Asked about it later, the authors termed sex among elves to be universal, or omnisexual as they put it, not limited to opposite genders or even specifically monogamous. Race and miscegenation were also discussed, as a singular offspring of elf and troll manipulates events in the later story. Both elves and trolls are disgusted by the idea of a half-breed, and the differing tribes of elves are almost different races, each with their own geographically induced differences. The Wolf Riders specifically are a direct product of their environment, as their ancestor took on wolf form to allow her children to be more adaptable to the world they found themselves stranded in. This near bestiality caused them to lack the immortality of more pure-blooded elves, and the wicked Winnowill is both stimulated and repulsed by the idea of it, taunting and insulting the more pure-blooded Leda of the Sunfolk with the information. However, the story also shows the overcoming of racism by the more progressive folk, as Leda accepts her life mate how he is, and elves work with trolls to attain their long-term goals despite ancient bad blood between them. Similarly, the elves work with more civilized humans and overcome their racism there when the humans happen upon a wounded Cutter and help to heal him. The book even deals with the horrors of death and war with the grief of survivors and the differing ways of dealing with loss. Examining the art specifically, the different tribes of elves are all very distinct, with their body language and facial expressions suggesting their attitudes. The wolf riders are wary but open, and often joyful and childlike in the right circumstances. Still, they are often mistrusting because they have been betrayed so often. The sun folk are generally more open. They have never known a world of danger and are mostly idle in their pursuits. The fact that they also possess a healer who can heal all their minor hurts makes them careless. They are complacent and it shows in their clothing and expression. We never saw curves like those on a wolf rider. The gliders, on the other hand, seem anorexic or starved and withdrawn. It's very representative of their interaction with the physical world. Their alabaster skin and pointed faces seem disconnected and otherworldly, and unfriendly, save for the kindly Lord Vol. The Go-Backs are a product of their ongoing war with the trolls of the frozen mountains. They are almost human-looking, lacking many of the natural angles of the other elves, and we find that they have been breeding without recognition for generations. Windy Peonies, gorgeous illustrations of the many settings and individual elves are a delight to the eyes, and a reader can't help but grow attached to the plucky elves who survive multiple trails and go on the grand quest for their origins and ancestors. There are no easy answers, though, and every time they think the quest is done, it seems there is more to do. And this is just the first 4 books. It gets even better in the next 4.